Thank you, Pete. So, as Pete mentioned, so just a quick overview that I too am from the first bubble, actually before the first bubble, so yes, I'm old. But beginning of my career, I spent kind of in the classic like C++, desktop application business, and then I moved into kind of a managerial role, reluctantly, as many people do in our business. And then I started working at Amplify. At the time it was called Wireless Generation. That's where I met Ed here, who's in the front row, where I became a director of engineering, which kind of was like a grandiose title for not a very grandiose position. And then I decided to move over to Spotify because I was really interested in their culture, really interested in what they were doing from a product perspective as well as an engineering perspective. And as usual, like not everything was as rosy as all the blog posts and presentations were put out there, but it was really interesting, and so far it's been a really great learning experience. During that process, as I've gotten more in tune with management and figuring out how to manage people, grow organizations, grow teams, I've become really interested in the effect of culture, the effect of the structure of an organization, and the impact that has. I think back in the beginning of my career, I was naive and thought, hey, you just gather up the best engineers you can find and it'll all work. Magic will happen. Which, I think at a small scale probably does work. That's how good ideas are formed. That's how things start out. But as you start to grow, it becomes a little bit more challenging. It's just not about finding the best engineers. It's not about finding the smartest people in the room. It's about finding the right people that can work together. It's about finding the right culture that fits yours. And there's not one to fit them all. You can look at Google, you can look at Facebook, great organizations to support their engineers, but does it fit your needs? Does it fit what you want to build? And I think those are the things that I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of years. So one of the things that kind of was the beginnings of this talk and the beginnings of me thinking about career development was looking at my father. My father and me, I spent many years thinking we were complete opposites, we were completely different. He was blue collar, working in skilled labor within the automotive industry. I went to college and graduated and got a white collar job building software. So we spent many years just not being able to communicate about that and talking about that. Unfortunately, he passed away, and I never had that conversation with them. But during that process, I started thinking about, is it really that different? I'm building software, which is a skilled position that required certain trainings. He built machines that built cars that required certain training, a certain skill set. Is it really that different? He quickly became a journeyman, which in the trade meant that you were be able to work alone, and you would be able to build machines, but you weren't a master. You weren't the ones like developing new processes, new things. One of the things that struck me with him too is he never once felt pressure to move into management. And I could probably guess that most people in this room have worked in large organizations have felt that pressure. Oh, you need to move up, you need to climb, you need to go, you need to start managing people, and you need to stop engineering and go this route, and maybe we'll all be CTOs, which is true for some of us, but it's not true for all of us, and myself included. So, a couple of things that are hard to read. So one of the things is I want to cover a little bit about how Spotify is organized, because I think that influences a lot of what our culture is. I think in a well-tuned organization, culture can kind of manifest itself both in structure as well as the people that are attracted to that structure. So this slide is just a kind of the promotional piece of, we're big and we're getting bigger. But the more interesting thing is, everybody's now an agile company and moving forward with, hey, how do we become even more lean? How do we become even faster? And all of those are buzzwords. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In Spotify's case, it started as a place where we were using Agile. We read the textbook, we started processing that, we hired in project managers, called them Agile coaches, and said, hey, let's do Agile, it's great. And it worked quite well at the small scale, but then we started hitting problems. We were finding that the Agile process was getting in the way. So the initial reaction was, let's be really agile and not do any process, which of course worked out really well. And what did work out well, though, is as we grew, we started letting the teams, the self-forming teams, actually start defining what their processes were. Some followed Scrum and sprints and that sort. Some decided that Kanban was a better approach. Some decided that, hey, we don't need anything. We're just going to meet once a day to talk about, make sure we're on the right page and move forward. And the idea being, let's not constrain that, because sometimes good ideas come out of those experiments and sometimes failures can teach you something, so let people explore those things. But we're continuously tweaking the process. But one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about lately is as we started to grow, and how many people out have read the white paper about Spotify's structure or seen the video? About a third, quarter. But one of the things that we started doing was when we first started growing, we said every team is a startup. They're not going to block on another team. They're not going to block on anybody else. They're just going to charge forward as if they were a startup, which worked great in that 50 to 100 person range. Because at that scale, you can't really be just this lean, mean machine that a 20-person startup can be. But if you break that up, you can actually do that. But the problem that we started having was alignment. And for those of you that use the product, about a year ago, it looked like a different product. Every time you went to a different view, it looked a little different. It felt a little different. The things, even the fonts were a little different at times. Some were dark, some were light. And it really looked like a product that was developed by multiple teams, because guess what? It was developed by multiple teams. So we started thinking a lot about the alignment issue. And so on one hand, we have extreme alignment, which if anybody's ever worked for companies that start with M and end in like Microsoft, they have high alignment, like their products are. And Apple is another great example of places that have high alignment because they have great structures to provide that alignment. But what they don't necessarily provide is a lot of autonomy. On the other hand, if you have extreme autonomy, which is where Spotify was, you have do whatever you want and hopefully it'll work out. And most people think of this as a choice. Which model do we want to be? And what we decided was it was really just a false choice. It doesn't matter. It's not a binary choice. And instead we started looking at a grid pattern about low alignment, low autonomy is like the danger zone. You don't ever want to be there because you're not getting any benefits and you're having a huge cost. So this is micromanaging organization. We've probably all worked in those organizations or have nightmares about them. And then we move up to high alignment. In the high alignment, we have low autonomy. High alignment, we say we need to cross the river. Now build us a bridge. So it's a management structure that's really about solving the solutions for you, and you become an implementer. That's great for certain people. Wasn't what I wanted. And everyone's in alignment. What we're striving for at Spotify is kind of the holy grail, which is high autonomy and high alignment. I don't know how close we're going to get to that. It's a work in progress. But here we say we need to cross the river, presents the problem, figure out how. How do we do that? That's where the autonomy comes in. So the team collaborates, innovates, figures out how to solve that problem and move forward. So this is kind of like where we want to be. Where Spotify actually is somewhere between here and up there. So we're in this area of entrepreneurial organization where chaos is okay because you're trying to build something, you're trying to get it out there, you're trying to vet your ideas. But you don't know if it's going to work, so why are you going to spend a lot of time about alignment? Instead, let's push forward, get it out there. We're moving from high autonomy, low alignment, and trying to get the more alignment without losing that autonomy. So in this model, you have your manager that's just hoping that things are going to work out. And this is your founder, your early startup founders, for those people in the room. So what we decided as we started scaling past that kind of 100 mark, we started thinking about how do we organize the company? And what we wanted to do was organize the company that wasn't going to completely break our culture, our startup culture. But we did need that alignment. And the way we started looking at it was we started having tribes. And the nomenclature is not important what the names are, but we wanted to distinguish it from kind of the more traditional models so that there wasn't confusion, there wasn't any implications. So we used tribe, the whole tribe model, to name that. So we basically said tribes, which are departments or areas of interest. Each squad has a PO and a cross-functional team. The great thing about that is that gives you your autonomy, but how do we get our mastery? How do we get our cohesion amongst the team? And that's when we developed this idea of a chapter. So the chapter is basically an area of expertise and has a chapter lead, which is what I am, and we manage people. For me, it's the back-end engineers, but there's also front-end, mobile, QA, agile coaches, everything you can think of. We have chapters for that to manage that group of people. So here we're doing our work stream. Here we're doing our how do we become better engineers or how do we become better at our craft. Then we have this idea of guilds. Since we're a large company now of 600 people or 600 engineers, some in Stockholm, some in San Francisco, and another site in Sweden and in New York, how do we kind of stay connected with our counterparts in the other offices? It came up with this guild idea, which is basically it's a meetup, but it's internal within Spotify. And it's people that talk, it's people that go to open spaces, it's people that have meetups and different things within the organization. Of course, that was the model. The reality is a little bit more messy. So chapters are supposed to be contained within a tribe because you get the whole autonomy, but autonomy with a mission. But as we grow, we don't want one manager managing one person, so we end up having cross-tribe managers. And the guilds get a little messy because sometimes they don't line up well with our chapters. And one thing that we realized is we have to be actually comfortable with that. You have to be uncomfortable with a little bit of chaos. We're trying to add some sort of control over the organization, but we don't want to have too much, or we're a different organization. We've changed our culture too much. So one of the things with aligned autonomy is you have to have a clear mission. You have to have clear leaders who are setting what that mission is, and then the teams are going to kind of come around and actually look at that and actually charge forward with what that mission is. We liken it to a band because 4 people playing instruments is pretty terrible unless they're actually aligned, and then they're playing a song and they're actually doing well. Plus, that fits our music theme. One of the other things that we want from our culture and that makes this model work, because it's very we don't have as much hierarchy, we don't have as much command and control. We don't want people with egos. We don't want people that think they're the best thing ever. Instead, and in fact, we passed on people that other organizations would be happy to have because they would come in and disrupt that culture. And I think that's one of the things that as you guys build your organizations, and as I move on to other things in the future and build different organizations, you have to be aware of is you don't want to disrupt your culture too much, because that's part of what made you what you are. So one of the things that struck me when I joined Spotify, outside of all of the other kind of chaotic elements, was there wasn't a lot of thought put behind how do we develop careers. We decided that we wanted this culture of minimal structure, just enough to get by. But what's the path of a developer who doesn't want to become a manager? There wasn't a lot there. Turns out there was some, but it was hard to find. So I started thinking about that, like I said, with my father, is, he had a different career path than me, but even though we have some similarities. So one of the things I started looking at was, okay, so we have this linear ladder. Linear ladder is very easy because you join, you become an intern, you become a junior developer, you become a senior developer, architect, team lead, whatever the titles might be, and eventually you make it to the VP of engineering and the CTO and everything's great. How many people in this room are going to be CTOs? Probably a larger number than normal because we're in a startup community, right? But not everyone is cut out for that. Not everyone wants that. It takes a certain skill set, a certain interest. So why are we forcing everybody up this instead of giving people choices? So some of the good things about this is it's familiar, right? Most companies in America actually operate in some fashion like this, at least in a white collar, and a lot of the blue collar as well. Each rung is clearly defined, so it's really, as a manager, it's attractive because I can say, oh, you want to climb to the next rung, here's exactly what you need to do, and I can help coach you and get you there. So it's really attractive because it makes my job easier. It's very clear on what is expected of people. It's very clear where you're going. So if that doesn't match, maybe you need to look elsewhere. So it's very good. It's very clear to have that conversation. It's also easy to get resources. It's very easy for me to go to the CTO of Spotify and say, so-and-so is doing really well. They want to take the next step into leadership. Here's what they need to do. They need this training course. They need this time. They need this. We need to start rolling people onto their structure, and we need to get them some experience. That's an easy conversation to have. It's also very easy for the CTO to kind of look at people who he may not know personally and say, I know exactly what value they're adding to the corporation because they are a senior or principal or staff or whatever moniker we put on them. It's also very explicit, so it's very easy to be recognized. We can work in organizations where somebody gets promoted and we make a big deal about it. We send out a notice, we have a party, and we make a big deal about it. So recognition is very easy. And if you're sensing a theme, there is a theme, which is it's easy. But what's the danger? It's very simple, but there is a cost, which is it's often not that simple. We may have great ideals and set out to say, this is exactly what it means to become a senior engineer. But when we come down to it, it's really qualitative. There's very few quantitative things that we can take into account. You're going to take into account lines of code, architectural meetings that they had, bugs that they created or bugs that they fixed. It's all bogus. So at the end of the day, we're trying to create a system that's very discrete, but at the end of the day, it's all about people, and it's all about ambiguity. We've also preferred to keep our structure flat, so we wanted to kind of define our positions based around the fact that you have a role, and that role, different people will fill that role differently, and that's great, and that's okay, and should be rewarded. But the fact is that your titles and your structure should be defined by that role. So for example, from an engineer to the CTO, it's engineer, chapter lead, who is the manager role. Then we have a tribe lead, and then it's CTO. It's not flat, but it's pretty flat for 600 to 700 engineers. The other problem is kind of part of the positive. Part of the positive, it's really simple and you can see where you're going, but what happens when you don't fit that mold? So part of the negative is it doesn't fit everyone's needs. It doesn't really allow for people to grow in a way that makes sense to them. And it also, I think this is what really got me, was it starts promoting people out of what they're actually good at and what they're actually interested in. I'm working with a colleague now who keeps telling me he wants to be a chapter lead, and when I ask him, do you want to manage people? No, I want more role, I want a bigger role and more responsibility. Well, okay, but chapter lead means that you manage people. Okay, well, I'll do that if it means more influence within the company, and I just think that's looking at it the wrong way. There's also no way to try new things out. So moving up means that you've got a promotion. What happens if that doesn't work out? What happens if you realize you're not good at that or you're not enjoying that? How many of us in this room would get a promotion and 6 months later say, you know what, I'm going to take a step down in pay, take a step down and try to tell my colleagues that this is not a big issue, it's just I tried something that didn't work out. That's a really difficult move to make, emotionally and psychologically. So all that ends up creating a factory of ejecting people because there can be only so many managers. We're not going to ever have an organization which has a one-to-one relationship between managers and employees. So what happens when you're ready to make that next step and there's not a place for you? Well, you're going to leave the company. Well, that's not great for the company. That's not great for the engineer to potentially if they really enjoyed their job. And then they might promote people beyond their ability. So this is the stereotypical that extends well past tech. And at the end of the day, the engineer in me says that every choice has its consequences, and you have to pick what you want to optimize for. And I think this optimizes for simplicity. It also assumes that plateauing is bad. I would argue that plateauing is not bad. That if you want to be an individual contributor and you're really awesome at it, and you just want to get better at that, great, go for it. Who am I to say that you should be a manager just because it's higher up on a graph somewhere? So I started thinking there has to be a better way. So one of the ways that's kind of gaining popularity is this idea of multiple ladders. So now we have, okay, you want to be an individual contributor, that's great. Let's create a ladder for that. And at some point in your career, you have to make a choice. Do you want to be manager? Do you want to be an architect? Or principal engineer architect in this model. So this is great because now I have a way to not manage people but still grow. So it kind of reduces that or mitigates that problem of people getting promoted into management positions that really don't like working in managing people. It's a certain skill that not everybody wants or has or interested has. It also still clearly sets up easy ways to recognize people, so you're still getting those benefits of the ladder. Still, it sets up clear routes and roles, so it still sets up that career path. And it's still familiar because it's just another ladder, but it's different roles and there's a different structure to it, but it's not all that complex. But of course, I think this is also limited because it still has some of those negative impacts of a ladder. It's still very explicit what it takes to move up the ladder, can't accommodate everybody. It usually gets muddled. I know you can't tell because it's a bit.ly link, but this is a discussion piece around Google's structure. And I'm not going to diss Google. They are great, and what they have works for them. But they also have thousands of more engineers than I have. And at certain scales, you have to give up certain things. And one of those things that you might have to give up is being able to accommodate everybody. You can't, the 80-20 rule at Google is very, very hard because 20% is a huge number of people. Or I'm sorry, 80%. And so you have to come up with constructs that work at scale. I would argue that most people aren't at that scale, and those complexities that they've created are really difficult, notwithstanding that they start at 3 and end at 11 for some reason. And it still assumes that the only way to grow is through more responsibility and influence. What about just getting better? What about just being a better programmer? How many people have been programming for 15 years and are a much better programmer than they were when they first started out? I mean, that was me before moving into a somewhat management career. and we should be able to reward that, and we should be able to have paths for that. Does that mean they're going to be getting the extreme raises of that rock star who's putting in late nights and doing everything imaginable? No, but that's not what everybody needs. They still want to be recognized for what they're doing. They still want to be recognized or to be compensated for that. And that it's not as clear cut as just climbing a ladder. It also doesn't really address that issue of how do you experiment. Transitioning between management and individual contributors is still very difficult. How many people are going to say, I worked with one engineer in my life who I'm currently working with, who actually stepped down from an engineering position or a management position to become an engineer again. It was difficult, even though it's what he really wanted, and it took a lot of work. That said, I think it can be part of the solution. I think it is an improvement over the single ladder, and at some scale it might be necessary. We're actually exploring this now. I'm on a working committee that, do we want a career ladder? What does that career ladder look like from an individual contribution? I don't know if I buy into it, but that's part of the discussion. That's part of our culture as we discuss things and we figure out as a group what's the best thing. So that brings us to what are the right things. So at the end of the day, I started figuring out what is career development. It's not about climbing some ladder, but what are people actually looking for when they want to get promoted? Everybody wants promoted. Everybody wants that, but what is it? So I started boiling this down after large discussions with a group of people, which is people want to get better at what they do. What my phrase is mastery. People want autonomy, I think. People have some more control over what they do on a day-to-day basis, whether that's the projects they work on or how they execute the projects. I also feel that people want recognition. People want to be the pat on the back when they do something really well. They want that feedback mechanism. I also want compensation, and I put these in a specific order for a reason. I think at the end of the day, at a certain point, the compensation isn't the most important thing for everybody, but it is still there. It's still, people want to feel that, hey, if I'm doing a great job, shouldn't I be making more than I did last year? The problem with the ladder process is that they usually concentrate on the recognition and compensation pieces. It's very easy to say, hey, if you're a principal engineer, this is what you make, and if you're a senior engineer, this is what you make. It's a very blunt tool. Like I said, it works for maybe the 80% of the people out there. It doesn't work for everybody. So what I decided for my purposes and for my group is we need to start thinking about how to optimize for the career development. My job as a manager is not to make my job as a manager easier. My job as a manager is to make career development easier. It's to make my engineers more productive. It's to make the bottom line more attractive. It's to push forward the company mission. It's not to make my job easier. But I think we continually look at ways to make manager, because that's human nature. I want to make my life a little easier so I can go home and play with my kid. I don't want to make more work for myself. But one of the things that we started exploring at Spotify is how do we start looking at what we've referred to as nonlinear things. So instead of only having that upward mobility path, how can we have things that are more horizontal? How can we allow people to grow, recognize people, and get to this idea of mastery and recognition without forcing everybody up this ladder? So two of the ways that we started looking at it, and this is not the end of the discussion, but two of the ways we started looking at that are called loops and add-ons, and I'm going to go through what we do for these. So loops are basically tools to help direct career development. Initially, I thought of loops as the annual review process that everybody has at larger corporations, right? As you gather up feedback from your peers or the peers of the people that you're working with, you figure out how well I've done this year, and guess what? That goes into some mathematical equation and comes out with a number that says that's your raise for the year. The way we've actually started working with it at Spotify is that loops are a tool for the manager and the employee to actually work out a career path. Has nothing to do with it, has very little to do with salary. So they actually don't happen at salary review time. They happen when the employee wants them to happen. And and you will solicit feedback. You will start a conversation with your management and your colleagues, and have a conversation about what am I doing that's great, what am I doing that needs work, where am I going, and what am I doing? And that you can have these as frequently or as infrequently as you want. So this is the first tool. So again, it's employee driven. This is the key part of it. It's not the, hey, it's been a year, let's finally have a conversation that we should have probably been having earlier. But let's have that conversation now because I have to put a number into a spreadsheet that tells you what your raise is going to be this year. We still have that process. It's not all great. But this process is about that feedback. The other interesting part of it that I haven't experienced before is that it's not anonymous. So most companies, when you're doing a review, the manager will solicit feedback. It'll kind of boil that down into common themes and then present that to the user so that you're not setting up a reaction between two employees that says, hey, you bitched about me, what's up? What I found though is that when you remove that anonymity, you actually start getting a little bit more honest and you actually get a little bit more constructive. It becomes less of a, Joe really pissed me off because he did this, and becomes a, hey Joe, I think you could work on this, and actually gives meaningful suggestions to people from a colleague. And this is actually borne out. If you look through, and I can't release it because it's all confidential for the people, but if you look through it, it's actually really interesting to see how helpful it is. And it's much more helpful than if I, as a manager, would actually describe it to them and say, well, some people in the team think that you're a little bit too aggressive when you're making your architectural arguments. But actually hearing it from people is meaningful. As a manager, I'm also giving feedback, which is also not anonymous, and so that they know what feedback I'm giving, so they can kind of start figuring out what the impression is from the different sides of the equation. And that drives the discussion. So it becomes much more of a discussion as opposed to a feedback session, as opposed to a, hey, here's the things I think you need to work on as an engineer, and becomes much more of a, this is where I want to go, and this is my strengths and my weaknesses. How do we actually get support for that, and how do I grow, and what's your advice? They're not directly tied to salary reviews, so I think our human resources department would say they're not at all related to the salary review process because they happen at different times. But we're human, so if I'm doing a loop and somebody's really struggling, is that going to impact the salary review process? Probably. If we do a loop and someone's really knocking it out of the park, is that going to affect our salary review process? Probably. But it's not a direct. It's not a fill out a form and then some mathematical equation. At the end of the day, it's a qualitative discussion about salary. It's also qualitative about career development, but they're two separate. One is forward-looking or backward-looking, which is your salary review. One is using that review to kind of project forward. And I'm not going to give you a salary adjustment based on what I think you might do next year. I'm going to give you a salary adjustment on what you've actually done. So that's why they're really two distinct, two pieces. So one of the other things is that we've been using is this idea of add-ons. So add-ons are just ways to expand your current role. So these are the people that don't want to change their role, don't want an advancement in that career path, but want to get better, want to expand their horizons, want to get some more skills. It's probably a little hard to see up here, but the idea is that the dark lines are your typical ladder pattern. So in our case, intern to engineer, chapter lead, tribe lead, and upward. But there's also these green dots which are value added. So maybe you're really interested in agile methodologies. Well, as you're a developer, some organizations would say, let the other people deal with that. You focus on development. We said, why can't an engineer also help further agility? Why can't they come out and speak? So as you can imagine, I'm working on my speaker add-on. Why can't they be a mentor at any different level? Doesn't have to be the manager that's the mentor. In fact, I really see my role as not to be the best engineer on the group, because if I was the best engineer, what the hell am I doing wasting my time managing people and not engineering? But I need to be a competent engineer. Maybe I'm really interested in architecture and managing people. How do I fulfill that? Well, I can be a chapter lead who gets the architecture add-on, and I can participate in the architecture of Spotify. So that's the idea of this kind of non-linear growth pattern. So roles are still defined by the institutional needs. So chapter, those basic big circles. The other thing that I think was a lot more controversial than I thought it was when I wrote this slide, and I'm working on a blog post about this, is that moving to management is not a promotion. I said this to people within Spotify, and I think one person cheered me, and about 45 people said, what the hell are you talking about? Of course it's a promotion. You're getting more pay, you're getting more responsibility, you're getting closer to that CTO level. And in reality, I don't think it is. At some point, sure, there is a promotion model. But at the end of the day, it's a different role. My role now as a chapter lead is part-time managing people and part-time engineer. My job as an individual contributor was full-time engineer. The CTO's job is full-time manager and managing the structure and the organization. It's a different role. If you ask me, even salary-wise, do I deserve a higher salary because I'm a chapter lead than somebody who's working on my team? No. I think, I think there are chapter leads who deserve more than a lot of the individual contributors. I also think there's a lot of individual contributors that should be compensated and recognized a lot more than some of the chapter leads. There's junior chapter leads, and they're learning, and they're trying to perfect their craft and trying to explore that new role. Why are we tying these two things together? And personally, I don't think it is a promotion. When I moved into management, I probably actually, if you would have gotten me a few beers in me, I probably would have said it was a demotion because it's a whole new world, and I felt like I was a new engineer again because I didn't know anything. So add-ons are doing two things. First of all, they're actually growing the engineers, or the individual contributor, because it doesn't just apply to engineers, and allows you to kind of figure out what you want to grow with. And since it's driven by you, it's really driven by your interest and your skill set. However, there's also the business value side, which, putting my manager hat on for a minute, is really important as well, because we can't just say, hey, do whatever you want all the time, because we still have a mission. In our case, we're trying to create a new industry, or help create a new industry, and figure out how to make music available to everybody. That's, arguably an important mission, and we need to get that done. It's not just about playing. It's interest and skill set defined, and again, that you choose as an individual contributor, or as a manager for that matter. And it's supported by the company because there is this added business value. I'm going to look at Ed again here because we worked with a company that did this idea of merit badges. And the idea with the merit badges was very similar, which was, hey, you can get the open source merit badge, which means that you're contributing to open source projects and you're being a great open source community member, which was kind of interesting. We would make it once a month. We'd meet up and say, hey, so-and-so got this badge, so-and-so got this badge. We joked that we would make sashes like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and that we would display these things. I think it was really interesting. It was really cool. But it wasn't really supported by the company. The support from the company became, we're going to buy you the merit badges for $3 a piece or whatever they were, which is, better than a lot of companies. But it wasn't like, we're going to help you get that merit badge. It wasn't that we were going to send you to training courses to become a better speaker. It wasn't that we were going to let you go to conferences on the open source community just because you were working on that merit badge. The difference with Spotify is we are doing those things, and we want the manager works with the engineer to say, oh, you want to work on this add-on. First, does that make sense for you, both skill set and interest-wise? And then how are we going to actually get there and come up with a plan? That may include training, sessions, workshops. More importantly, it might just be time. It might be time off to go to an event. It might be time during your job to say, I'm going to devote 10% of my time to learning this new craft, and I'm not developing software during that 10%. That's kind of a big commitment from a company to say, stop what we're paying you to do and do this other thing which may or may not work out. Google famously had that with their 20% project. Says, take your 20% and do what you want. The idea being is the 1% chance that we actually have a good idea that's marketable is worth the investment of the 20%. Similar type of model here. Less structure around it. Less definition. So some of the driving forces that kind of led us down this path was that we want to do things and tell people. That kind of gets to the recognition piece and the mastery, which is you can try new things and tell people about it. Sometimes you just get an itch and say, oh, I really want to investigate this new technology. Maybe it's not applicable to what we do, but explore it anyways and then tell people about it. You're passionate about maybe something that's unrelated to your day-to-day job. Really passionate about writing. Maybe that's a background. Well, why not explore that? Why not explore that and try to marry that to your current role? You'd also like recognition for your efforts. I think we've all worked in companies where we worked on secret projects, right? Oh, I can't tell my manager because he might tell me no, so I'm going to spend some time here and there and try to get it done. And if it's successful, I'll make a big deal about it. But if it's a failure, I'll downplay it. Well, if you put a lot of effort into it, why isn't it a success when you tried something and it didn't work out? That's a success. You've learned something. Why don't you share that? Why aren't people up clapping for that? So I think that led us to the add-ons. The other part of it was try something new. Is sometimes you don't know what you're interested in. I think I might be interested in architecture, but I don't know until I try it. You get a little bored. Maybe you just want to shake it up a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. You also might want to try to do something new without transitioning. A few years ago, I decided that I wanted to kind of explore what it would be to be a product owner. I thought it was really exciting to be able to help drive the product. It was a technology team. So I stepped up and to my manager said, I want to be that product owner. We need one. I'll fill that role. About 3 months in, I realized what a monumental mistake I made because I hated it. But it was really hard to back out of because I went in full force. And I was spending 75% of my time in that, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe I should work with a product owner and actually see what that's about. And I can help them in their job, but I don't have to jump in with both feet. That opportunity wasn't available. And then you're not sure you want to switch roles. Again, you go into this management role. It might sound exciting, but then you get there and realize that, like most jobs, a lot of it's mundane, a lot of it is detail-oriented, and you might not be interested. So why all of a sudden get a team of 10 people and then realize that you don't like it and have no way of stepping out of it? Add-on may allow you to lead a project. It might allow you to lead an initiative. So it also gets you out of your comfort zone. So just like I said, shake it up. Maybe you acquire a new skill. Maybe it's about learning a new programming language. Or maybe it's about learning a new technique or new technology. Push yourself in a new direction. Sometimes this needs gentle nudging from the manager too, that people are getting complacent. They're really good at what they do, but sometimes outside experience will help. And you shake things up and see what skills that you don't know that you have that you actually have. Like I said, I was reluctantly pushed into management. I think I'm an adequate manager, but I think I'm a much better manager now than I would have given myself credit for 10 years ago. But I thought I would hate it. I ended up liking it. The only way I got to do it was because somebody pushed me in that direction. So the other part of it is you can create, is that you choose an add-on or maybe you can define a new one. And the process of defining a new one is define a goal. So what are you trying to do? Define metrics. So we're big on metrics at Spotify. Data rules everything. So instead of just saying, I want to be better at open source, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that you're contributing to 5 open source projects? Does that mean you own an open source project? Define the help that's needed. This is the key that most people that have tried processes like this don't do, which is what do you actually need from the company to get what you're done? Is it time, money, what have you? So a few examples, and this is a work in progress. So we have speakers, road managers, kind of like we don't have project managers, we have agile coaches. So road manager is kind of filling that area where we have cross tribe, I guess, if you will. Initiatives that need to have some sort of coordination. So we have road managers help drive that. Coach, so this is your agile. I want to be more interested in agile. An evangelist. I really like Cassandra and I really want to make Cassandra use at Spotify better. Well, that's an evangelist. Architect, so looking at the big architecture picture. Mentor. So we're big on that the managers are not the mentors. In some cases they are, but by default I'm not the mentor of the people on my team. I'm coaching them and I'm working with them. The mentors come from their colleagues on the team. And sometimes those colleagues are more junior and just getting them up to speed on what Spotify's like. Sometimes those mentors are much more senior and trying to bring the junior developers a little bit, elevate their skill set. Writer, so we have Haka for those out there that are interested in writing. They're writing a workshop. We're on our second session of workshop where we're working with, I believe, 10 engineers, myself included, on how do we become better writers so that we can start talking about things in the external community. Trainer, so we don't have any trainers within Spotify outside of our business side, so how do we train people on how to do development, how to do things within Spotify. Open sourcer that I mentioned before. So a couple of closing remarks, which is, it's a work in progress. We're testing out this hypothesis, and at the end of the day, it's this hypothesis. It's our idea of what might work. It could be a complete failure. In fact, we didn't just start this last week. We started this in January 2013. I looked it up today. It was January 2013 when we first rolled this out. So for those doing the math, it's a while. It's over a year and a half. And it was a bit slow to adopt, but we're refining it. And what part of the work in progress is that, well, this is a duplicate slide. So part of what we discovered was that there were more complexities. So, being a fairly agile, quick to deliver company, one of the things that we tend to do, and this is probably fairly common, is we tend to have really great ideas, run with them, get a prototype out, test whether that prototype works, build a minimum viable product, and then kind of get distracted by the next thing, right? It's, I kind of liken it to, for those of you that seen the movie Up, it's the squirrel aspect. It's where the dog keeps chasing after the squirrel and then gets distracted by the next squirrel, and it's common. And I think that this process suffered a little bit from that, as we had the 80% of the work done and said, hey, we got this great idea, let's develop it. And then when it came to actually rolling it out, it kind of fizzled. And nobody was really behind it, nobody was pushing it, nobody was talking about it. Another aspect that we struggled with was defining new ones. So on the previous slide, I showed you about, I think, 8, 9 different add-ons. Not all of those are actually add-ons. Some of those are my ideas of what should be add-ons. So we rolled out with 6 different add-ons. Now you can imagine 6 doesn't cover a lot of territory of people's interests. And we defined no process whatsoever to define a new one. So I mentioned define the goal, define the metrics, and then define the help that you needed. That's all from my head and a couple other engineers who have been recently thinking about this and refining the system. So that wasn't there in the initial step. And then the third one, which was probably the much more important one and harder one to solve, was we concentrated on what does it take to achieve an add-on and spent very little time on what does it mean once you've achieved it. So pushback from people in management and higher levels of management were like, oh, that's great. So you're just creating a system where people are going to game the system and get a bunch of achievements and get all their merit badges and, you know, like all the games on our phones, and let's collect all the medals. But what is that actually adding in? Because nobody's actually using those skills that we've paid for and that we've invested in to actually further their teams or further their products, which is totally a valid concern and a valid feedback. So one of the things that looking forward is how do we reward not the achievement of the add-on, but the actual application of the add-on. So we want to support add-ons so that you can fail or you can try something that didn't work out, and that's okay. So we're not going to give you demerits for that. But we're also not going to consider it a success, and we don't want to tie salary to add-ons, because then you're just going to say, oh, well, for $5,000 I can learn how to be an agile coach, and for another $3,000 I can start working on architecture, and pretty soon I'm making $500,000 a year. We don't want that model, but offering nothing to the company. So instead what we want to say is, you have all the freedom in the world to explore these options and explore these things, and we're going to support that, but we really want you to start applying some of those as well. And it gives me a tool as a manager working with people to really call people out and say, hey, look, you're going to 14 different things and trying to do way too much. Let's focus on 1 or 2 things and see if that works out. And then let's figure out how to actually apply that. So those are some of the things that caused us, I think, to not be a failure, but to be a little bit more of a slow start. A bunch of us are now trying to help correct those problems. But at the end of the day, we could all just be wrong. It could just be a bad model. So we'll see. So one of the reasons that I started giving this talk, and I've given it a couple times now, is that, you know, I think this is a big area within tech that we've spent very little time on, because it's very easy to slap a ladder on it and call it done. I don't think that's the end of it. I think as a manager, and more importantly as a person actually in the system, I want something better. I don't want to be forced down a path that is simple. I want to be forced down a path that makes sense for me. And I think the only way we're going to actually solve it is as a group. It's not going to be what Spotify does or what Google does or what Facebook does. It's going to be what everybody starts having a conversation around it. It's going to be people who are interested talking about it. And I think that was, at the end of it, not so much my goal is to solve the problem, but to start talking about it so that we can start figuring it out. So that's my email address. The obligatory "we're hiring" slide. And what's funny is I've had this slide on the different presentations I've done for probably the entire year I've been at Spotify, and it just occurred to me the other day that that's actually a Spotify employee. It's not just stock footage. So while I was interviewing for Spotify, there was a lull in my recruiting, because everybody in the company flew to Stockholm for a big party called Summer Jam, which is what you see a picture of. So it's at a hangar in Stockholm, Sweden. What you can't quite see is there's a band playing here, and all of these are Spotify employees and significant others that are just probably half drunk and just having a good time, which is kind of fun that I just thought it was stock footage. So I kind of breezed through a lot of this stuff. I'm betting people have questions. So we have plenty of time for questions if anybody has. So the question was for the people who are going to be listening to this later. The question was, how do we bubble this up, and how do we actually define a new thing and actually get accepted? So the whole idea of autonomy actually is pervasive within Spotify. So the CTO is not there to be an approver. Instead, he's there as I'm going to pull the emergency brake if something I think is going off the rails. So the idea is that we work on that as individuals or as a small group, figure out what we actually want to do. We communicate that up through, whether it's through wikis, Google Docs, different emails, different mechanisms. In this case, it's usually a wiki, although we're slowly moving a lot of that stuff to Google Docs. And then we define it there, open it up for people. It's not closed, it's not secret. And then if anybody has an objection or has some input, they're encouraged to present that, whether that's CTO or just another engineer. But it's really an organization where it's about do, don't ask, which helps. If it was a little bit more structured hierarchy, or a little bit more micromanaging, then it would be a lot harder, because then you have, even in a fairly flat organization, we would still have to talk to the chapter lead, then the tribe lead, and then the CTO. Instead, we just kind of do that, and it's much easier to ask for forgiveness and permission, and nobody really calls us out on whether or not you should have done that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how do you know that what you're doing is actually better or worse than the more traditional approaches, say single career ladder, or sort of the bifurcated career ladder?
So the question is, how do we know if it's better? It's a really hard question, just like anything else when it comes to career development, because the metrics are pretty scarce. One metric is we do a lot of employee happiness. So every quarter we do a study, and we talk to people, and sometimes it's part survey, part communication, part talking, and some of those metrics on that is how are you feeling about your career development. So to be honest, the fact that the add-ons haven't been working and haven't been taken off showed up in these reports, and what we saw was that our scores in that area of career development were actually lower than they had been in a long time. And that's what started us leading along the lines of, do we need this career ladder in addition to the add-ons? Do we need this individual contributor ladder of senior developer, principal developer, what have you? And that's formed a working group. So that feedback loop is going to be helpful, because I think we're going to probably have that second ladder in conjunction with the add-ons. Retention rate. Our retention rate is not, I'd say it's not great across our industry, to be honest. I think average within tech is staying 2 years or less with the company. Some places less than a year, some places maybe as high as 3, but most places don't have great retention. So I think that's something that we're cognizant of, and we started looking at is, what is our average tenure of people within Spotify? How many people are leaving? I think the industry average is about 10% of your staff a year will leave. We're lower than that, but not as low as I would like. I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of like 8%. And so I think those are some of the few metrics that we can look at is just the happiness of our employees. I think the other part of it is, how much are we still innovating? Because I think the business side of this is that as we invest more in people, the more innovation will happen, the more great things will come out of that. At the end of the day, both product-wise, will we venture, how can we add more value to music? From a technology standpoint, when I started, we were at about 20 million users, or 25 million users. Now we're at over 40 million users. So just in a year, that's a pretty impressive scale. So that takes innovation, that takes work. If we're not doing that, I think we'll start to falter. And I think that's a little bit more, I would call it squishy, because it's really hard to tie it directly to career development. But I think the only way you're going to be able to innovate like that is keeping developers happy, keeping them engaged, keeping them learning new things. If you have really high turnover and you have people that are disengaged, you're going to fail at the mission of whatever that mission is. It could be the greatest product in the world, and you're not going to get it. So I think those are I think at the end of it, it might just be the sheer success or failure of Spotify.
So far the feedback that you do have is not positive?
It's not negative or positive. So the feedback is kind of, oh, those exist. It's really a knowledge gap, right? So when I started working with engineers, they would hear about add-ons, and they'd be like, well, how do I do that? And just the sheer amount of effort to find information about it. So this goes to the selling. Even a great idea, I think, poorly sold is a failure. And I think that some of that failure to sell it was part of it. Now, if we actually had everybody that knew about add-ons and people were unhappy with it, I'd be more than happy to walk away from it and say, look, great experiment, we learned something, move on. But where I came in is I still think the idea is solid, and half the people or more than half the people in the organization don't even know they exist, which is not a good place to be. So part of what I wanted was to correct some of the things that we saw as problematic, and then we're going to go and this road manager idea of and let's actually talk about this with real people. Let's sit down with teams, let's sit down with managers and chat about it to get that feedback going, because we could be completely off in left field.
So I have a question about this idea of the matrix where you have self-directed teams, but then you have chapter leads. How do you guys protect against chapter leads from having I guess undue influence on how the team works by being able to affect multiple teams across the board?
So the question is, I think boils down to, whenever you look at a matrix model, the fear is, oh wow, now the people have two bosses.
Yeah.
And that is a distinct fear. So part of it is hiring the right chapter leads, to be honest. Part of it is setting the expectations, which is my role as a chapter lead is not to give people work. If I tell people to do something, I failed. Instead, what I should be doing is influencing how they do their work. So we're having discussions about what does it take to be a back-end engineer? What technologies are we using? What design patterns? Those are discussions that are happening in the chapter. So those have an indirect influence on the work, because you could say, we're going to do things that take twice as long as this other approach. But those are very indirect. The work itself comes from the team. And part of my relationship with my manager is that he's calling me out because there is a human reaction to say, hey, this thing needs to get done. The easiest way to get it done is to tell so-and-so to go do it. If I do that, I get called out on that, both by the people on my chapter as well as my manager. So it's really kind of like calling people out on their BS, and hiring the right people are the ways to keep people honest. And I think transparency helps, because if I tell people to do something and in their morning stand-up they can't do what their team needs them to do because I told them something, that creates a really quick feedback loop.
Is there 360 reviews that you are now accountable to all of the teams, not just the people in your chapter?
So me as a chapter lead, yes. So my reviews come from all my chapter members, as well as the managers that I'm working with on the different teams, as well as the other more senior people on those teams. So that all does influence it. It's a cultural thing at the end of the day, which is people are willing to call people out on their BS. And that's not frowned upon, and that's not considered politics. That's just considered doing a good job.
So I had a question about the add-ons and budgeting. You mentioned some of the add-ons are going to require you to take a class, or perhaps go to a seminar, these kinds of things. How does Spotify manage those budgets and decide, okay, well, we're going to have so many people fill this add-on because we have this much budget?
So thankfully, so the question is about how do we budget for this and account for that. So the way budgeting works is each tribe has their own budget. Part of that budget includes obviously things like salaries and all that stuff. But part of it is also for career development. As it stands, what that allows us to do is it's enough of a pushback just so that we don't try everything. But so far I haven't had a discussion where somebody's really wanted to have an add-on and there hasn't been a budget, because at the end of the day, and this may be a scale issue, at the end of the day, the money's there for a certain amount of career development. We have rough estimates too. Each engineer should be able to go to a couple conferences a year. If it's really remote, maybe one. So we have these general ideas of what's applicable. But at the end of the day, there's enough pressure to have that really direct conversation of, are you doing this because you're really interested, or are you doing it just to play? And if it's just to play, we'll find some other way for you to have fun and learn things in a little bit more budget-conscious way. But so far, it hasn't been too much of a constraint that we can't do things.
Curious about the flatness of the org, as you mentioned earlier, and how big chapters can be. So you're a chapter lead of back-end engineers, but are you the chapter lead for all back-end engineers, or how big are the chapters generally?
So the question is, how big are the chapters? And the answer there is, because we were spending so much time working with people, I mean, as you can imagine, this process is not cheap from a labor standpoint, is we try to keep chapters about 10 to 12. In some cases, they get a little bit bigger. So as you can imagine, with 600 engineers, there's multiple back-end chapters. That's where the guild process comes in. So the guild is basically the idea that you have these chapters that should be small enough to be functional teams and small enough that the manager has time with each person, but we still need that commonality across the space. And so as a guild, we'll run things like on-conferences where we'll gather up once or twice a year as an entire group. The one we just did in New York was about 100 people of back-end engineers. And we met up at the Ace Hotel and spent a day just talking about back-end engineering and another day talking about data processing and data pipelines with about 80 people. So those sorts of things are there. But we try to keep it at 10 to 12. So it's a system that's not optimized for cost. And again, this gets back to the fact that we have the money to grow. But it's really optimized for speed of the product and getting things out there and the development of the engineers and the individual contributors.
You seem to describe somewhat of a static situation in your slides. I'm curious how things grow. So BlackBerry comes to life tomorrow, and then suddenly it's 10 million users. How do you spin up a BlackBerry team, and how do you organize the people around that?
So the question is about how do we spin up to kind of be more dynamic and be able to maneuver a large company. So part of it is having a cross-functional team, so we don't have a BlackBerry team or an iOS team or an Android team. We used to be honest. We used to have those teams, and we decided to base it around feature set. So in your example, if BlackBerry all of a sudden became a player and we wanted to be able to support that, what we would do is we would have to recruit people who knew how to program in BlackBerry, but then we would add those to the feature teams, and it wouldn't be a huge disruption from the team's mission. It would be the same mission with new expertise and new personnel and new people. There are things, though, that do challenge things. We have a platform team, for example, that's dedicated to providing us with systems and infrastructure and platforms that we use. As you can imagine, that changes all the time. And so there's teams forming and dissolving and reforming. The group that I work on is the monetization group that's trying to keep the free tier free by basically ads, right, and figuring out better ways to deliver ads and user experience. So as you can imagine, that changes almost monthly on what we're actually working on. It's very challenging. And so what we've been developing is we have a group of engineers, and we keep forming and changing teams as projects come alive. And the challenge there is to figure out how to do that with less chaos. You want the agility without the chaos. And that's something we do struggle with a little bit. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. Back here.
How do people kind of get exposure to different parts of the stack? Is that typically through kind of the approach you have on interest and kind of going after interest, or if they need more mentorship, like if a back-end engineer wanting to do BlackBerry or something else, do they kind of almost go to a different chapter, or how does that work?
Question is, what happens when people want to make a kind of a bigger shift in their career and try something new? So it's actually happened twice with me, once actually today, so good timing. So I had one gentleman on my chapter who was a Java programmer, really not happy with back-end engineering, just getting a little bored. And so he wanted to explore Android development. So the initial steps were sending him to training courses to actually learn the basics of Android development. And so him and a group of people went to that. Then we set up an exploration where he was still on my chapter and I was still working with him. And he started doing more Android development and getting Android projects. So it was kind of a slow rollout. And now we're at that stage where he really enjoys it, and we're starting to roll him over to the mobile chapter. So it wasn't just oh, you want to do mobile development? Not my problem. Here, go forth and go bother him. Instead, it was a much more organic, slow growth thing. And then today I have a front-end web developer who's really much more of a full-stack developer and has been concentrating much more on the data pipeline stuff. So we had a conversation today of how can he start exploring joining our chapter, starting to participate with our group without having to go all in. And so that'll be another slow rollout, probably over a couple of months. In the back.
So I had a question around, you mentioned self-directed teams and self-running teams. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So can you give an example of something that was chosen to be developed How was it chosen that, hey, we're going to build this new thing? How is the decision made? How the people who makes the decision on who goes on that team to build out that new feature?
Yeah.
And how do you like make sure you have the right people on that team and how do you measure its progress and also make sure that it's like follow through to the end and further on after it's built and shipped?
So the question revolves around how do you have a self-managing team but still kind of meet the mission. So part of it is like resisting the urge to micromanage. So it usually starts with an initiative from Daniel Ek, who's the CEO of Spotify, who may say something as broad as, hey, we want and this is part of a true story of, we want to offer a mobile free tier. So up until November of last year, if you were on mobile, you had to pay. There was, and that was just part of it. He wanted to be able to have a mobile free tier, and as you can imagine, that's wide-reaching. There's lots of people that need to be involved in that. So what happened at that is that rolled down to the next set of tier, where design had to start figuring out what would that look like. The legal team had to start working up on contracts. The labor relations people had to start reaching out to the labels and say, what does this look like? How does this structure work for you and work for us? And then from a technology standpoint, we have to figure out how to build the thing. Because it wasn't going to just be here's some ads and here's some songs that we had on the desktop. So really, it started with Daniel Ek making this proclamation, and then each individual director or VP saying this is what we need to do as a group, and that kind of rolls through the team. And if the team feels like they're not structured or they don't have enough expertise, that information gets bubbled up and say, look, we can't meet these goals. And that starts a discussion at the tribe level to say, we need more resources, we need to hire, we need to do things, we need to move people around. So it really is one of those, the big picture things are being pushed down from above, and then there's things coming up from underneath that kind of meet there, and it really is about discussion. It's not always the easiest discussion. Product owners don't always want to have spend time in tech debt, but they get it if you actually put it together a compelling case.
The first one is there a similar setup for engineering? Can you talk about label relations?
Yeah. So the question is how common is this across Spotify and all the different fields? So in the technology, so we really split the company into kind of technology and business. On technology, it does apply to everybody, which includes product owners, designers, developers, QA, agile coaches. So all of that add-ons apply and all these different structures apply. On the more business side of like labor relations, legal, HR, those sorts of things, not so far. But that is something that we're exploring, is what things are they doing that are applicable to what technology does, and vice versa, so that we're trying to see if there is a commonality. We'll come back to it.
I'm kind of curious about how this transitions into your platform architecture, as Conway's law in practice. So can you give a sense of how many repos this results in across tribes, across chapters, and how far down the sort of micro stack you embrace it? So whether it's services only, micro apps, so different data persistence that sense of it.
So the question is, how much does this organizational structure influence our architecture? Quite a bit. So we have tried to structure our architecture to achieve that autonomy. So it's microservices on the back end. We have basically at the bottom tier a microservice, the tier right above that, and then we have an aggregation service so that the microservices themselves will never communicate with one another. So we don't get into these whole one call results in 47 different things. Then we have an aggregation layer so that the client app, we kind of came from this model where the application would make multiple, like most Ajax-y type of things, you'd hit a page and maybe there'd be 47 calls to the site to get all the assets. And we said, that's not great, so let's just do one hit. So that's where aggregation services kind of came into play. So the aggregation services are owned by a team, like the views are owned by a team, but the infrastructure is owned by all of us. The microservices are usually owned by a team. And then the other part of it is on the client app side, we have squads that we call container squads, and what their idea is build the platform. So build the thing that you plug your feature into to make sure things like build processes are stable, to make sure that the common things that you need to do are taken care of. Make sure, you know, they're the ones working with Apple to get things approved and working with the Android store. They're working with all of those things to provide our feature teams a place to put their feature. And then the feature teams really own their feature. You know, and that's a work in progress. With iOS, it's in one place, and with Android, it's in a different place, and they both have their strengths and weaknesses. Android is much further along in their more continuous deployment or continuous delivery type of model, whereas iOS is much more structured around like the development practices. We're at time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
That was great.